Hello and welcome. My name is James Foreman, also known as Triple J, and this video is part one of a four-part series on how to create emblems and kind of logo type things in Blender. For those that don't know, Blender is a free open source program that you can go download right now that is incredibly powerful and versatile tool that can allow you to make things like this. This is a logo, a little emblem. I don't know what you want to call it. A logo is like 2D, right? And an emblem is like 3D. So it's 3D, but on the computer. I don't know. Anyway, I created this for my fire team that in a game that I play called Arma, a little organized group where we get together on the weekends and do some fun stuff, play some missions. And it's kind of like a role play thing, right? So I like to make cool little logos for the teams that I'm in so guys can, have something to unite around and think it's real cool. And I figured I would share some of that knowledge with everyone else and put it in a tutorial format because I think it's a surprisingly easy thing to do. With a basic foundation in Blender, you can make something like this in full 3D. And I think a lot of people would find some value in that. So as I said, this video is part one of a four-part series. The first part is going to be an introduction to Blender that covers basic navigation and manipulation within the object view. That sets up this tutorial for anyone who has maybe never touched Blender before in their lives, because Blender is pretty hard to get into if you've never done any kind of 3D modeling in the past. Part two of the series is going to be basic modeling, covering the edit mode and mesh creation. Then part three will be advanced modeling, which will be mesh manipulation using modifiers to create some kind of advanced shapes like this chain here that comes around the border and this chain of bullets here, stuff like that. And then part four of the series will be rendering, which will cover UV mapping and material creation in Cycles, which is the render, it is a render engine for Blender. Anyway, I guess I'll go ahead and say right now, since this is part one, if you have experience with Blender and you have, maybe spent a couple hours in it, messing around, maybe made a couple objects, feel free to skip part one entirely because I will probably not be introducing anything you do not already know. However, if you do not have any experience with Blender, let's get right into part one right now. So, we don't want to mess with this kind of complicated mesh right now. We haven't gotten there, but hopefully you'll get here by the end of part four. So let's go ahead and just open up a new file here. And so this is the startup file. If you've never started up Blender before, and this is the first time you're booting it up, this is probably what you're going to see. All right, so first, before we do anything at all, let's just talk about the interface of Blender, because I'm sure for someone who's never seen it before, this is kind of a lot going on, right? First of all, the middle section here is called the 3D viewport. It's just kind of like the main region. This region can be changed. You can change windows and stuff, but we'll get to that in a second. This left region here is called the tool shelf. All right, it's got all sorts of, it's basically a toolbox of different stuff that you can use to create things in here. The bottom left is called the operator panel. And the operator panel is kind of context sensitive. So right now it's got nothing in it. But if we start messing around with some tools, you'll be able to change some key settings on some of those tools down here in the operator panel. Over here on the right side, we have the outliner. Let's go ahead and make it a little bigger. The outliner has all the objects that are in the world, so you can keep track of everything pretty easily instead of just having to click on stuff here. And then down here we have the properties in the lower right. The properties is where you will change a lot of the very in-depth settings that kind of apply to everything. But there's different tabs for many different things. The properties over here, and then down here, this thin little bar here is called the header. The header has some important menu navigation options as well as some very important toggles and settings for what's going on in the viewport window. And then at the very bottom here, we have a timeline. The timeline is just what it sounds like. It's a chronological order frame rate type deal. And we're not going to mess with it at all in the course of this four-part video because we're not going to do any animation. We're going to do just an object. So we're not going to do any keyframing or any of that kind of stuff. But you can do all of that down here in the timeline. So now that we've got the basic layout out of the way, let's talk about making new windows. All right, so I brought it up for a second there. I kind of indicated you can make new windows. This will not really come up until the very end of our tutorial when we start doing UV mapping, so it's not a big deal right now. but it bears mentioning that all of this stuff can be totally rearranged however you please. And you can do that by going in the upper right hand corner of each little section, and you'll see there's these little, like, 3 little diagonal lines in each one of these main sections. If you click on that and you drag it, you can make a whole new window. So now I've got a 3D viewport over here and a 3D viewport over here. And you can change these in the lower left hand corner by going here and selecting different settings. You have a text editor where you can straight up code stuff in Blender. You can make another properties window if you really wanted to. You can make any kind of window layout you want. I'll even further add, if you have multiple monitors, if you hold down Shift and click on that, you can actually make those a separate window, which gets kind of annoying in Blender because they're not really like inherently tied to each other. So if you want to actually use this, you can't just move your mouse over. You have to like click it first and then you can move your mouse. That's a whole different thing. Don't worry about that. If you want to get rid of one of these windows, you have to kind of like, you have to drag it to the right. It's like a left and right type deal. It's kind of weird. Sometimes it can make it hard to rearrange things, but that's basically how you do it. You'll notice that when you get that little arrow that says, hey, we're going to take away that window. All right. So now that we've gone over the windows and the the basic layout of everything, let's talk about camera controls. All right. You'll notice I did move the camera a little bit. Got a little ahead of myself. You do the orbit of the camera with the middle mouse button, okay? If you hold down middle mouse button, your camera will orbit the center of the camera location, the anchor point, I guess you could say, which by default is the center of the grid where this 3D cursor is. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, if you want to just translate the camera, if you just want to slide it, you can hold down Shift to accomplish that. If you hold down Shift and do middle mouse button, instead of doing the rotation, you'll slide. Okay? Now, if you don't want to do one of those things, if you kind of want to keep like a very like straight head-on kind of structured type of view, you can use your numpad on your keyboard, which hopefully you have a numpad, and the numpad has different settings on it for each button. So if you press 1 is kind of like a head-on view, 3 is kind of like a side view, 7 is a top view, and 9 is a bottom view. Now, in between those 4 corners, it's kind of like an arrow. It's kind of like it's kind of like arrows. It's kind of like a directional pad, really. So if I hit 4, I'm actually turning the camera. All right? Same way if I hit 6. If I hit 2, it's the same in a different axis, kind of rotating up and down with 2 and 8. All right. Now, if I hit 5 being in the center of this numpad doesn't really make sense, right? Well, that's why 5 is actually a toggle. 5 toggles between isometric view and perspective view. You can see this is perspective and this is isometric. All right. Now, most of this tutorial I'm going to say right away is going to be done in isometric view, and we're only really going to have perspective view when we go to test out the renders and things like that. Reason being is that perspective may be like a realistic kind of view where, things that are closer, the proportions change in relation to how far away things are. That actually makes it really hard to edit things in 3D because it kind of makes it harder to see what lines are parallel and things like that. So it's much easier just to edit everything in isometric. And it might take some getting used to if you've never done 3D stuff before, but trust me, it's definitely better. All right. And actually, before I go any further, I want to turn on a little add-on here that you do not need to do this because this add-on is just a screencast keys add-on to make it so that you guys can see the buttons that I'm pressing. So this is purely for your benefit, and you do not need to do this. There we go. Middle mouse, shift middle mouse, things like that. I'll also just add that this add-on is not perfect in the most current version of Blender that I'm using. So that's why I am making an effort to actually state the keys that I'm pressing as much as possible, because some of them, for whatever reason, don't show up in the screencast keys. But these do help on average. So hopefully that'll allow you to keep track of all the buttons, because probably the hardest thing about learning Blender is just when you watch the tutorial videos and everything is just keeping track of what buttons everyone's pressing, because there's a lot of hotkeys. A lot of hotkeys. All right. So now that we've gone... Oh, we're still on camera controls. All right. So... what happens if you move the camera like way over here and now things are real weird, right? You're like, try to get back to center. but now it's still not really in the center of my view, and now I kind of messed everything up. What if you wanted to get back to that perfectly centered view that you had at the beginning? Well, you can press Alt Home. Remember I told you there was going to be a bunch of hotkeys, right? Alt Home centers the camera wherever the 3D cursor is. And like I said, right now, this little red guy in the middle, little red like crosshair, that's the 3D cursor. And we'll talk more about that guy. But Alt Home centers the camera wherever that guy is. So now that I've pressed it, I'm perfectly back centered on where the cube is. And of course, if you haven't already noticed, you can zoom in and zoom out with the scroll wheel on your mouse. Now we've talked about camera controls, camera manipulation. Let's talk about object manipulation. So you can see that right now our cube has this kind of like orange outline around it. If you right click on an object in the 3D viewport, you are selecting that object, and you know it's selected when it becomes highlighted in orange. All right, so this orange, this little like light orange outline indicates that right now the cube is selected. If I click on the camera, if I right click on the camera becomes selected. If I right click on this lamp up here, the lamp becomes selected. So in object mode, after you've selected a particular object, you can manipulate that object in basic ways. All right, and you can do that by pressing G to move it. G is kind of like the button for translation. So if I press G, you see the outline becomes white now because I'm manipulating it, and I can move it on my screen. Move it wherever I want. Now it's over there. Now, you'll notice that when you do that, when you just press G and use your mouse to move that object around, it's moving in a plane that's kind of perpendicular to what your view is. Most of the time, that's not very helpful. Or if it is helpful, it's probably only helpful when you have the camera aligned in a specific way. For example, if I used 7 to get a top-down view, and then I hit G to move the cube around, that is pretty useful because I know it's staying flat on the plane. So that's not bad. Also, by the way, to get the object back where I'm using Control Z. Control Z is the classic undo hotkey. It works in Blender too. So when you just press G and just G and move, you're just moving perpendicular to whatever your view is at that particular time. Most of the time, what you'll be doing to actually move things in a precise way is you'll be constraining that movement to a certain axis. You do that by pressing G and then pressing the button of whatever axis you want to constrain that movement to. So for example, X. So I've hit X here, and now you see there's a red line that goes through the X-axis that indicates I'm constrained to the X-axis. And now when I move my cube, no matter how I move my mouse, even though I'm moving my mouse in a circle here, the cube's only going to move along the X-axis. Same thing with Y. Hit G, and then hit Y. And now we've got this green axis, and now the cube's only moving along that axis. Same thing with Z. G, and then Z, up and down. All right? Control Z, put it back in the center. Now, what's really cool is you can constrain to 2 axes at the same time. You can do that by pressing G and then holding down Shift and pressing the letter of the axis that you don't want it to be constrained to. I know that sounds kind of weird, but it makes sense, right? Because you need to press one button to indicate 2 axes, right? So you pick the one that you don't want. So we're going to hit Shift Z. When I hit Shift Z, I've now constrained the movement of the cube to the X and the Y plane, okay? So now you can see, using the grid reference lines, that the cube is not changing its location along the Z-axis at all. It's staying at the same Z-axis height, but it's moving along the plane of the X and the Y-axis. Let's do this with a different one. Let's do G, Shift X. And now when I hit Shift X, I'm constrained to the Z and the Y plane. And it's moving kind of like in a little circle like this. All right? All pretty helpful stuff. So, what else can you do other than translation? Well, of course, you can do rotation. So if you hit R, you can rotate the cube relative to your viewport. But again, not really useful because we don't really know, this rotation isn't very precise. It's just whatever the viewport is perpendicular to it. So again, let's hit R and then X to rotate the cube around the X-axis. R and then Y to rotate the cube around the y-axis. And then let's see what happens if we try to rotate Shift Z. There you go. Now, with the way rotation works, and since this is a symmetrical object, constraining to the x and the y-axis for rotation is pretty much the same as just constraining it to the z-axis. All right. Now, the last thing you can do, the basic manipulation, the most basic important manipulations you can do in object mode is scale. So I can make this bigger or smaller by pressing S and then using my mouse to drag the cube bigger or smaller. And you can see kind of a little important thing right here. When your mouse gets to the edge of the viewport, it's like in Pac-Man, it moves to the other side, right? So if you really want to make this big, you can just keep dragging and dragging and dragging and dragging and dragging. You don't have to worry about like resetting your mouse or anything like that. Also, though, if you really want to make something significantly smaller or significantly bigger, instead of using your mouse, you can always use your numpad as a form of entering units. That applies to translation and scale, but it's especially applicable with scale because scale is kind of just inherent to the object. And so whatever you press on the numpad becomes a multiplier for the scale. So if I hit S and then 2, I've made it twice as big. If I hit S and then 0.5, I've made it half as big. All right? That's very helpful. And again, I'll just mention that you can do that same thing with the translation. It's just it's weirder to do and kind of less common to do because it uses Blender units, which are just magical grid units. it is referenced to this grid, but it's not something that converts easily into inches or millimeters or whatever. So you can see if I hit G, X, and then 2, I move over 2 squares on this grid. So don't forget that if you want to do very precise things, maybe if you're like putting things in a specific order, you can always use your numpad to scale, rotate, or move things in a precise way. Let's do it if we do X, rotate X 45, rotated the cube 45 degrees along the X-axis. It's really helpful stuff. All right. So the last thing we're going to do in this part 1 kind of introduction to the basic things of Blender is some more advanced tools with the camera, because believe me, when you get halfway through a model, you've probably moved the camera around so much that it's getting unruly, and you may want to be focused around a part that is not necessarily in the middle of the screen. For example, if I move this over here, but I've still got some stuff in the middle, I want to be working over here, and I want to have the center of rotation be over there, but it's not. So how do I move the center of rotation? Well, remember that I said that Alt-Home will reset to the camera to wherever the 3D cursor is. So you can move the 3D cursor by left-clicking on the screen. And when you click on nothing, it kind of just puts it in a really weird perpendicular spot, because you have to think in the 3D world there is nothing here. So what plane does it stop on when I'm clicking? It's kind of random, right? But if you click on an object, it actually puts it on the surface of that object. You can see that 3D cursor is where I clicked on the face of that cube. So with the 3D cursor there, I can now hit Alt-Home again, and now the view is centered on the 3D cursor. But this introduces a new problem, right? Because, well, that's cool that I can have it centered on the face of that cube, but I actually kind of want it in the center of that cube. I want this cube to be dead in the middle of my viewport. How do I do that? Well, there's something called the snap menu. So if you hit Shift S, you open this little sub menu called the snap menu. And what you can do is you can control where the selection is in regards to the 3D cursor and where the 3D cursor is in regards to where the selection is. So let's select the option Cursor to Selected. What that does is it moves the cursor to the center point of whatever, or I should say the origin of whatever object you've selected. So if I've selected this cube and I hit Shift S, Cursor to Selected, it goes to the cube. If I select this lamp and I hit Shift S, Cursor to Selected, the cursor will move to where the lamp is. And then after I do that, so let's do it to the cube again, I can hit Alt-Home again, and now, even though the cube is not in the center, I have centered my view perfectly around this cube. And then if I wanted to work on something back over here, I can just left-click, Alt-Home, and now I'm centered over here. Well, maybe I want it in the actual center, because like I said, it just went through the grid because there's nothing here. It kind of just picks an arbitrary height. I don't know how exactly that works. You can always reset it to the center because that's an option on the snap menu. Cursor to center. We'll put the cursor right there, Alt Home, and now we're back in the center. All right. Now, this has another functionality to do it because it allows you to place objects kind of back in the center if you wanted to. So let's say I clicked on this cube, I moved it around randomly. Now I want it to be back in the center because I can't just Control Z anymore. I've done a whole bunch of other stuff I don't want to undo. I just want this cube to be back in the center. Well, if we go back to our snap menu, Shift S, selection to cursor. And now the origin and that object are moved to exactly where the 3D cursor is. And since I centered the 3D cursor, now the object's perfectly back in the center. This is something you'll probably end up using a lot for different things. And sometimes it's not even about just moving the camera around, it's about positioning objects precisely. For example, if you created a circle, you could put the 3D cursor in the middle, in the center of that circle. You could select all the vertices, put it in the center of the circle, and then that way, when you create a new object, the object will be created at the 3D cursor, precisely in the middle of that circle. So that's kind of a very easy way to align things in Blender. All right. Well, with that concludes part 1 of this tutorial. We have now gone over all of the very basic necessities, the things you need to know in order to do pretty much anything in Blender. And so now you should be able to know what the interface is. So in the future sections, when I talk about certain parts, you should know what they are. We've talked about making new windows, which will come into play in part 4. So, don't hold up on that one. I'll do a little refresher then. We know how to manipulate the camera in every conceivable important way. And we know how to manipulate objects in object mode in all of the basic important ways. So, please stay tuned for part 2, where we will go over basic modeling, which will cover edit mode and mesh creation.